On August the 1st, 1770, near the village of Fumo Asa in Milavia, 40,000 Russian soldiers prepared to face an army 3 times their number. Marshal Rumyantsev was about to commit what seemed like a suicidal act of madness. Rather than retreating in the face of the 150,000 Ottomans led by Grand Vizier Eva Zaid Halil Pasha, he had decided to attack. In less than 4 hours, this seemingly insane decision would become one of the most crushing military victories of the 18th century and marked the beginning of the end for the Ottoman Empire in Europe. For over a century, the Ottoman Empire had been sliding into decline. The Janissaries, the elite soldiers who had made Europe tremble in the 16th century, had become a corrupt force resistant to reform. While the Ottomans stagnated, their enemies modernized. Catherine Roman II of Russia had transformed her army by adopting the military innovations of Peter the Great. The Tsarina harbored a grandiose dream, the Greek project, which aimed to reconquer Constantinople and restore a Byzantine empire led by her grandson Constantine. In 1768, the tension between the two powers reached its breaking point. Zaporojian Cossacks, pursuing Polish insurgents, burned down the Ottoman town of Balta. Catherine Roman II refused to accept responsibility for this incident. Urged on by the Khan of Crimea and by France, Sultan Mustafa Roman III demanded in September 1768 the immediate evacuation of Poland by Russian troops. Faced with St. Petersburg's refusal, Constantinople had no choice but to declare war on October the 6th, 1768. The problem was that the Ottoman army was completely unprepared for a major conflict. In January 1769, a Turo-Tatar force of 70,000 men led by the Khan of Crimea, Kirim Gur, launched a massive offensive against central Ukraine. The objective was clear: to capture slaves from the local populations and strike a decisive blow before the Russians could react. But this strategy failed miserably. The garrison of Fort St. Elizabeth repelled the attack with fierce determination, allowing General Ruev to launch his counter-offensive towards the Black Sea. Pyotr Alexandrovich Rumtsev was no ordinary general. Born in 1725 in Moscow, some whispered that he was the illegitimate son of Peter the Great himself, as his mother had spent a great deal of time with the Tsar. True or not, Rumyantsev undeniably possessed the military genius that characterized the new generation of Russian officers. He had fought during the 7 Years' War against Prussia and had distinguished himself with his tactical audacity and his ability to innovate on the battlefield. The Russians took Taganrog and then swept through the Danubian principalities of Milavia and Wallachia. In 1770, they occupied Yashi and then Bucharest. One after another, every Ottoman fortress fell. However, a lack of reserves prevented Rumyantsev from fully exploiting his victories. His army, despite its successes, was operating with dangerously stretched supply lines. Meanwhile, Catherine Roman II launched a spectacular operation in the Mediterranean. Her fleet, having departed from St. Petersburg, suddenly appeared in the Aegean Sea and confronted the Ottoman navy at the Battle of Cheshma on July the 5th, 1770. The result was catastrophic for the Turks. Their ships anchored off the island of Chios were destroyed in a gigantic fire. The eastern Mediterranean was now open to the Russians, although crossing the straits remained impossible. 3 weeks after Cheshma, Rumyantsev won a decisive land victory at Lara on July the 7th, but this battle revealed a major problem in the Ottoman camp. After their defeat, the Turks and the Crimean Tatars retreated in 2 completely opposite directions. The Tatars fell back towards Ismail and Kiliya, while the Ottoman forces of the Grand Vizier headed towards the village of Frum Osa near the Kahagol River. This separation of forces would have dramatic consequences. Grand Vizier Eva Zahil Pasha was a man under pressure. The son of a former Grand Vizier, he had been appointed to this crucial post in December 1769 in the midst of a military crisis. Despite successive defeats and the loss of almost all of Waqia and Bessabia, Hal Pasha still believed it was possible to regain the initiative. What finally convinced him were the Russian prisoners that the Tatarakan Kaplan sent him after Lar. The interrogation of these prisoners revealed a vital piece of information. Ruintsev's Russian army was nearing the end of its operational capacity. Food and ammunition stocks were almost depleted. It was now or never. Halil Pasha rushed back to Constantinople to organize an emergency war council that lasted several days. The Sultan and the Ottoman commanders debated the strategy to adopt. The conclusion was unanimous. They had to launch a massive counterattack before the Russians could be resupplied. Grand Vizier mobilized all available resources from every corner of the empire. Troops poured in. By mid-July, he had assembled an army of 150,000 men, including 30,000 infantry and cavalry. His considerable forces crossed the Danube. Morale was high despite recent defeats. The soldiers knew their enemy was weakened and isolated. Hil Pasha established his fortified camp on the heights of the left bank of the Kahagol River, east of the village of Vulcan. The position was strategically excellent, with the river to the west, and numerous small lakes and marshes to the east, which limited the mobility of the Russian forces. Furthermore, the Tatar army of 100,000 cavalry was camped only 20 km away near Lake Yalpu. With this potential reinforcement, the Ottomans theoretically had an overwhelming numerical superiority of almost 6-1. The Grand Vizier gathered his troops and gave a fiery speech. He promised there would be no defeat this time. The army responded enthusiastically that there would be no retreat, whatever the cost. The war drums echoed in the Ottoman camp. Everything was ready for the final assault that was meant to crush the Russian army definitively and re-established Turkish domination over the Balkans. On the other side, Rumiatseb was perfectly aware of the perilous situation he was in. His scouts had reported that the Grand Vizier had succeeded in reassembling a massive army. The Russian marshal faced a terrible choice: retreat and abandon all the territorial gains of the campaign, or accept battle against an enemy that vastly outnumbered him. Military prudence would have dictated a retreat. Any sensible general would have avoided combat under such circumstances. But Rumiantsev was not just any general. He had studied the terrain, observed enemy movements, and above all, he had absolute confidence in a tactical innovation he had perfected: the mobile infantry square. This formation was not new in itself. The Romans had used it against the Parthans, and it was regularly employed to defend against cavalry. But Rumiantsev had transformed it into a formidable offensive instrument. Instead of forming a single large static square, he organized his army into several independent squares capable of moving and supporting each other. Each square consisted of 4 ranks of soldiers armed with muskets, with reserves, officers, and standards in the center. The tactical advantage was considerable. A well-held square could unleash devastating volleys on enemy cavalry, creating a rampart of dead horses and men that protected the following ranks. Moreover, by forming several squares arranged in a checkerboard pattern, Rumiantsev avoided friendly fire and allowed his formations to cover each other with crossfire. But the audacity of Rumiantsev's plan went much further. Instead of waiting for the Ottoman attack in a defensive position, he decided to take the offensive. This was pure madness in the eyes of many of his officers. Attacking an army 3 times larger, solidly entrenched on high ground with massive artillery, was suicide. Yet Rumyantsev had calculated his chances. The Ottomans expected a defensive battle. Their tactics relied essentially on massive cavalry charges intended to break enemy formations. If the Russian squares could hold under these charges, the Ottoman infantry, less disciplined and less well-trained in line firing than the Russians, would be at their mercy. Furthermore, Rumyantsev had noticed a crucial detail. Despite their numbers, the Tatar forces had still not arrived on the battlefield. On the night of July the 31st to August the 1st, the Russian camp was buzzing with feverish activity. Soldiers checked their muskets, ensured their powder remained dry, and sharpened their bayonets. Officers distributed the final instructions. Rumyantsev had divided his 40,000-man army into 5 main squares, each commanded by an experienced officer. Coordination between these formations would be crucial. The marshal knew that everything depended on 3 factors: the discipline of his troops, the firing speed of his infantry, and his own ability to maneuver his squares in the heat of battle. A single formation that panicked and broke would guarantee the collapse of the entire army. In the Ottoman camp, the atmosphere was entirely different. The soldiers were feasting, confident in their imminent victory. How could 40,000 starving Russians short on ammunition resist 150,000 Ottoman warriors? Grand Vizier Halil Pasha was finalizing his arrangements. His plan was simple but effective. Launch his cavalry in successive waves to break the Russian lines, then send in the infantry to finish the job. With the Tatars in reserve, the outcome was not in doubt. At dawn on August the 1st, 1770, the two armies prepared to face each other in what would become one of the most important battles of the 18th century. At the first light of day, Rumyantsev gave the order to march. His 5 squares began to move towards the Ottoman positions, advancing methodically across the plain. From the top of their fortifications, the Ottomans watched in astonishment at this apparently suicidal maneuver. The Russians were attacking with an army 3 times smaller. The Grand Vizier could not believe his eyes. This insane audacity would make his task easier. He immediately ordered his cavalry to prepare to charge. The Ottoman cavalry, among the most feared in Europe, launched themselves in a massive formation towards the Russian squares, which continued to advance imperturbably. What followed stunned observers. The Russian squares did not break. On the contrary, they halted in perfect order and opened fire with devastating precision. The discipline acquired under Peter the Great and perfected by Rumyantsev paid off. The Russian soldiers did not wait for the cavalry to be upon them to fire. At about 30 m, the 4 ranks of each square discharged their volleys in continuous rotation. The carnage was immediate. Horses collapsed by the dozens, throwing their riders to the ground. Those who managed to get close were met with a wall of bayonets and corpses. The Russian squares functioned like killing machines, pouring continuous fire on the waves of Ottoman cavalry. Each charge broke against the Russian formations in a clash of iron and screams, but Halil Pasha did not give up. He launched wave after wave of cavalry, hoping to exhaust the Russian ammunition or create a breach in their lines. The charges continued for hours. The noise was deafening, a mixture of gunfire, horses' neighs, war cries, and agony. Rumyantsev observed the battle from his command post, coldly analyzing every development. He noticed that the Ottoman charges, though fierce, lacked coordination. The different cavalry corps attacked in a disorganized manner without a real overall plan. This was the moment to exploit this weakness. The marshal ordered his squares to begin maneuvering. Instead of remaining static, the Russian formations began to advance and pivot, creating firing angles that caught the Ottomans in enfield. This tactic of incredible audacity in the midst of battle required exceptional discipline and coordination. A single square that became disorganized during its maneuver would be immediately overwhelmed, but the Russians executed the maneuver to perfection. The squares were now advancing towards the Ottoman positions themselves, turning what had begun as a mobile defense into a true offensive. The Turkish cavalry, already exhausted by their unsuccessful charges, found themselves caught in deadly crossfire. The Russian artillery, which had been carefully positioned, began to pound the Ottoman camp, and cannonballs tore through the enemy ranks, sowing death and confusion. Halil Pasha desperately tried to rally his troops and organize a coherent counterattack, but chaos was spreading through his ranks. The Ottoman infantry, which had not yet really participated in the fight, suddenly found itself under direct pressure from the advancing Russian squares. The Turkish foot soldiers, less well, trained in line firing and demoralized by the spectacle of their cavalry's massacre, began to waver. Around noon, after 4 hours of fierce combat, the situation definitively turned. One of the flanks of the Ottoman army gave way under the combined pressure of 2 Russian squares maneuvering in tandem. What had been a line of defense turned into a gaping breach. Rumyantsev, with the instinct of a great captain, immediately saw the opportunity and launched his reserves into the breakthrough. The Russian squares, which until then had advanced methodically, accelerated their progress. They penetrated deep into the Ottoman formation, sowing panic. The Turkish soldiers, seeing their lines broken and their cavalry decimated, began to flee in disorder. The rout quickly spread throughout the entire army. Halil Pasha tried in vain to stop the flight. He exhorted his men to hold their positions, threatened, pleaded, but nothing worked. Fear, a contagion that spreads faster than any cavalry charge, had seized his army. Soldiers threw down their weapons and fled towards the Danube, abandoning the camp, the artillery, and the flags. The Russians pursued the fugitives relentlessly. What had been a pitched battle turned into a manhunt. The exhausted and demoralized Ottoman soldiers were cut down by the hundreds as they desperately tried to escape their pursuers. The fortified camp, with all its provisions and artillery, fell into Russian hands without significant resistance. The most troubling detail of this day was the complete absence of the 80 Tatar cavalrymen who were camped less than 20 km away. Despite the sound of the battle, which must have carried to their position, and despite the Grand Vizier's calls for help, they did not move. The reasons for this inaction remain mysterious. Perhaps they judged the battle already lost. Perhaps the Tatar Khan decided to preserve his forces rather than throw them into a certain defeat. Whatever the case, their absence sealed the fate of the Ottoman army. When the sun set on August the 1st, 1770, the battlefield of Kagul presented an apocalyptic scene. The corpses of more than 20 Ottoman soldiers littered the plain alongside the carcasses of thousands of horses. So much blood had been spilled that parts of the ground had become impassable, transformed into a reddish quagmire. On the Russian side, losses amounted to about 1-0 men killed and wounded, a ratio of 20 to 1. This almost unbelievable disparity testified both to the devastating effectiveness of Rumyantsev's tactics and the total collapse of Ottoman combat capability. The Russians captured 130 cannons, a considerable prize that would significantly strengthen their artillery. But more importantly, they seized all the Ottoman flags and standards, crucial symbols in a war where military honor counted as much as territorial gains. The loss of these emblems represented a profound humiliation for the Ottoman Empire. Pale Pasha managed to escape with the remnants of his army, but his career as Grand Vizier was over. He would be relieved of his duties in December 1770, replaced by Seladar Mh Med Pasha, the man who had promised his soldiers there would be no defeat, had presided over one of the worst military disasters in Ottoman history. In the weeks following Kagul, the Russian army exploited its victory with relentless efficiency. Without significant opposition, Rumyantsev launched his troops to conquer all the major fortresses in the region. Ismail, considered one of the most important strongholds of the empire, fell. Then it was the turn of Kilia, Ackerman, Brela, Isaksha, and Bendir. In a few months, the entire Ottoman line of fortifications along the Danube collapsed like a house of cards. This series of victories earned Rumyantsev the surname Zadan-Neski, the Trans-Danubian, celebrating his triumphant crossing of the Danube. Catherine Roman, too, promoted him to the rank of field marshal and showered him with honors. The Tsarina offered him the governorship of Ukraine, formerly called Little Russia, a post of immense prestige that his father had held before him. The victory at Kagul also had major psychological repercussions. It definitively destroyed the myth of Ottoman invincibility. For centuries, the Sultan's armies had made Europe tremble. Now they were perceived as a declining force, incapable of competing with modern, well-organized powers. Kagul marked a decisive turning point in the Russo-Turkish War of 1768-74. Before this battle, the conflict could have gone either way. After Kagul, the outcome was no longer in doubt. The Ottomans had lost their ability to conduct major offensive operations. They were forced into a purely defensive strategy, desperately trying to minimize their territorial losses. In 1771, Russian troops completely occupied Crimea. The Kate of Crimea, a vassal of the Ottoman Empire for 3 centuries, came under Russian domination. Catherine Roman, too, installed a protege, Shahin Jair, de facto, turning the territory into a Russian protectorate. This loss was colossal for Constantinople strategically, economically, and symbolically. The Ottoman collapse worried European powers. Austria and Prussia feared that an overly powerful Russia would upset the continental balance. Frederick Roman, II of Prussia, dreaded an agreement between Russia and Austria to divide the spoils of the Ottoman Empire. Austria, for its part, considered the Danubian principalities its natural path of expansion and was alarmed by the Russian penetration into this region. These geopolitical concerns led to an unexpected solution, the first partition of Poland in 1772. To compensate for Russian territorial gains at the expense of the Ottomans, Austria, Prussia, and Russia agreed to divide portions of Polish territory among themselves. Frederick Roman, II, received Polish Prussia. Austria obtained Galicia and Russia seized eastern Ukraine. This cynical transaction sacrificed Poland on the altar of the balance of power. Despite the disaster at Kagul and successive territorial losses, the Ottoman Empire refused to capitulate immediately. Peace negotiations began but dragged on. The Sublime Porte was reluctant to concede on all fronts, still hoping to reverse the military situation. In 1774, Rumyantsev finally crossed the Danube with his army and entered Bulgaria, directly threatening Constantinople. This terrifying advance forced the new Sultan, Abdulhamid I, who had succeeded Mustafa Roman III, to accept serious negotiations. The Ottoman sovereign understood that he no longer had the means to continue a war he could not win. On July the 21st, 1774, exactly 4 years after the Battle of Kagul, the two empires signed the Treaty of Kuchak-Kinarja. This document redrew the map of Eastern Europe and the Black Sea in a way that would influence geopolitics for over a century. The terms of the Treaty of Kuchak-Kinarja were devastating for the Ottoman Empire. Russia renounced the Danubian principalities of Moldavia and Wallachia, which technically remained under Ottoman suzerainty. but in practice this renunciation was largely offset by other massive gains. Russia obtained the strategic ports of Azov and Kinburn, finally giving it the long-coveted access to the Black Sea. This was the culmination of an objective pursued for over a century by successive czars. With these ports, Russia could now build and maintain a permanent fleet in the Black Sea, radically transforming the naval balance in the region. Crimea was declared officially independent, but this independence was a diplomatic fiction. The Kate effectively became a Russian protectorate, a prelude to its outright annexation in 1783. This acquisition would allow Russia to control the northern access to the Black Sea and to have a major naval base at Sevastopol. The Sultan also recognized Russian sovereignty over the Zaporo ex-Jain Cossacks, the fierce warriors who had played a crucial role in triggering the conflict. Even more symbolically, Catherine Roman II obtained the right to build an Orthodox church in Constantinople. This church became the symbol of Russian protection over the Orthodox Christians of the Ottoman Empire, a clause that would be invoked repeatedly during the 19th century to justify Russian interventions in Ottoman affairs. Russia also acquired significant commercial privileges and the right to install consuls in the empire to oversee these privileges. Russian merchant ships could now sail freely on the Black Sea and access the straits to reach the Mediterranean. These economic advantages, combined with territorial gains, transformed Russia into the dominant power in the region. Finally, Turkey had to pay a considerable war indemnity to Russia, adding financial humiliation to military defeat. The victory at Kagul established Rumants as one of the greatest military commanders of his time. His innovative use of mobile infantry squares revolutionized tactical thinking. Rather than considering the square solely as a defensive formation, he had turned it into an offensive tool capable of maneuvering in the heat of battle. This approach profoundly influenced the military theorists who followed. During peacetime, Ray Sev put his ideas on paper in several works. Instructions in 1761, Right of Military Service in 1770, and Thoughts in 1777. These works served as the theoretical basis for the reorganization of the Russian army undertaken by Grigory Potemkin. In the following years, another Russian officer, Alexander Suvorov, carefully studied Rumant's methods and perfected them further. Suvorov would become one of the greatest commanders in military history, winning victory after victory by applying and developing the principles established at Kagul in 1791 at the Battle of Kluja. Suvorov crushed an Ottoman army 5 times larger with only 5,000 soldiers, repeating Rumyantsev's feat on a smaller scale. The tactical innovations developed at Kagul spread throughout military Europe. Armies observed with attention how a force inferior in number but superior in discipline and coordination could defeat a much larger adversary. Mobile square formations, coordination between infantry and artillery, the importance of fire discipline. All these elements became standard principles of modern warfare. For the Ottoman Empire, Kagul marked the beginning of a long agony. The battle exposed the structural weaknesses that had been undermining the empire for decades. The Ottoman army, once the terror of Europe, had proven incapable of competing with a modern, well-organized power. Attempts at reform were systematically met with resistance from the Janissaries and conservative elements of the Ottoman establishment. The Janissaries, who formed the army's elite corps, had become a reactionary force opposed to any modernization. Their conservatism and their propensity to revolt against any reform paralyzed military modernization efforts. Some Ottoman leaders understood the urgency of the situation. Baron Dutat, a French military advisor, was invited to reform the Ottoman artillery. European engineers and officers were hired to introduce modern techniques, but these efforts remained superficial and fragmented, unable to profoundly transform a sclerotic military institution. The loss of prestige was as devastating as the territorial losses. The Ottoman Empire had always maintained its authority partly through its reputation for military invincibility. Kagol destroyed this aura. The subject peoples of the Balkans, the Greeks, Serbs, and Bulgarians, saw it as proof that the Sultan could be defeated. This realization would fuel the nationalist movements that would tear the empire apart in the 19th century. The Eastern Question, as European diplomats would call it, had just opened: how to manage the progressive decline of an empire that still controlled immense and strategically vital territories. This question would dominate European diplomacy for over a century until the final collapse of the Ottoman Empire after World War I. After his triumphs of 1770–74, Rumyantsev became without question the most famous military leader in Russia. Catherine Roman, too, showered him with honors and wealth. He received the governorship of Ukraine, a post he used to continue the integration of these territories into the Russian Empire. Some criticized him for promoting serfdom in New Russia, but his policies reflected imperial will more than his personal convictions. However, his glory also aroused jealousy and rivalry. Grigory Pakin, Catherine Roman, II's favorite, viewed Rumyantsev's fame with envy. During the Second Russo-Turkish War from 1787 to 1792, Pakin prevented Rumyantsev from taking a major command. The old marshal even suspected Pomkin of deliberately reducing his army supplies to put him in difficulty. Disgusted by these court intrigues, Rumyantsev resigned his command. In 1794, during the Polish Kosciuszko uprising, he was nominally appointed commander-in-chief, but it was his rival Alexander Suvorov who actually led the armies in the field. Rumyantsev did not even bother to leave his Ukrainian manor in Tashin, which he had transformed into a fortress. He died there on December the 8th, 1796, just a few months after Catherine I, the Empress he had served so well. His death marked the end of an era. The Napoleonic Wars, which would soon engulf Europe, would cause Western historians to forget the exploits of this Russian general. Yet his tactical genius and military innovations had helped shape the art of modern warfare. An obelisk commemorating his victories was erected in St. Petersburg, the Rumyantsev obelisk on Vasilivki Island. During World War II at the Battle of Kursk, the Red Army named a major military operation, Operation Polo Vits Rome-Sev, in his honor. This belated recognition testified to the lasting importance of his military legacy. The repercussions of Kagol were felt far beyond the Russo-Ottoman borders. The battle accelerated Russia's transformation into a major European power. During Catherine Roman II's 34-year reign, Russia won every war it participated in. The two Russo-Turkish Wars and the Russo-Swedish War. Considerable territories were added to the empire, and its foreign policy was crowned with success. This Russian expansion profoundly altered the balance of power in Europe. Russia was no longer the semi-Asiatic peripheral nation it had been at the beginning of the 18th century. It was now a major player whose armies could move from one end of the continent to the other, and whose fleets sailed in the Mediterranean. Austria and Prussia had to adjust their strategies to account for this new reality. France, traditionally an ally of the Ottoman Empire against the Habsburgs, saw its influence in the region diminish. Great Britain began to worry about the threat Russia could pose to its interests in the Mediterranean and later in Central Asia and India. Catherine Roman II's Greek project, although it never materialized in its original form, had a lasting influence on Russian policy towards the Ottoman Empire. The idea of liberating Constantinople and restoring an Orthodox Christian empire in the Balkans continued to haunt the Russian imperial imagination for over a century. This ambition would play a crucial role in successive Russo-Turkish conflicts and ultimately in the origins of World War I. From a strictly military perspective, the Battle of Kagul offered several major lessons that influenced tactical thinking for decades. First, it demonstrated the crucial importance of discipline and training over numerical superiority. Rumiantsev's 40,000 Russians were not supermen, but they were superbly trained, disciplined, and capable of executing complex maneuvers under enemy fire. This quality more than compensated for their numerical inferiority. Second, Kagul illustrated the power of defensive formations used offensively. Infantry squares had always been considered purely defensive, intended to repel cavalry charges. Rumants proved they could be used as mobile platforms of firepower, capable of maneuvering and attacking, while maintaining their defensive cohesion. Third, the battle highlighted the importance of coordination between different arms. Rumantsev's infantry, artillery, and reserves functioned as an integrated system. Each element supported the others, creating a synergy that multiplied the effectiveness of the whole. Fourth, Kagul revealed the dangers of an army too dependent on a single type of force. The Ottoman army relied essentially on its cavalry to win battles. When this cavalry proved ineffective against the Russian squares, the entire military structure collapsed. Tactical flexibility and diversity of military capabilities were essential. Fifth, the battle demonstrated the importance of leadership and initiative at the command level. Rumantsev did not simply apply a pre-established plan. He constantly adapted his tactics based on developments on the ground, exploiting enemy weaknesses as soon as they appeared. Kagul was not an isolated accident. The defeat was part of a process of Ottoman decline that had begun long before 1770. Several structural factors explained this growing weakness. The Ottoman economy had been suffering since the 16th century. Raging inflation caused in part by the influx of American silver, which devalued currencies, had eroded purchasing power. The tier system, which had long financed the army by granting land to cavalrymen in exchange for military service, had collapsed. Corruption plagued the administration, diverting resources that should have financed military modernization. The Devshir-May system, which recruited young Christians to become Yanissaries and administrators loyal to the sultans, had lost its effectiveness. The Janissary had become a hereditary caste more interested in preserving their privileges than in military efficiency. They violently opposed any reform that could threaten their position. Technologically, the Ottoman Empire had fallen considerably behind. While Western Europe was experiencing the scientific and industrial revolutions, the empire remained largely frozen in its medieval structures. The printing press, introduced very late, had not spread as it had in Europe. Education remained dominated by traditional matras that taught neither modern mathematics nor natural sciences. Politically, the Sultanate had lost its vigor. The sultans of the 18th century were generally weak, manipulated by court factions, the Janish and the Grand Viziers. The Ottoman political system, once remarkably effective, had transformed into a sclerotic structure incapable of adapting to the challenges of the modern world. Paradoxically, the Russian successes of the 1770s contained the seeds of future problems. Massive territorial expansion created tensions with other European powers who viewed this increasingly dominant Russia with suspicion. Great Britain, in particular, began to see Russia as a potential threat to its interests. Russian access to the Black Sea and potentially the Mediterranean worried London. In the 19th century, this rivalry would lead to the Crimean War, where Great Britain and France would ally with the Ottoman Empire to contain Russian expansion. The integration of vast territories populated by non-Russians also created administrative and political challenges for St. Petersburg, Crimea, Ukraine, the Caucasus territories. All these new lands had to be governed, pacified, and integrated. This titanic task would absorb a large part of Russian imperial energy for decades. Furthermore, the very success of the Russian armies created a certain complacency. The idea that the methods that had worked against the Ottomans would be just as effective against other adversaries would prove dangerous. When Russia faced more modern and better organized European powers like Napoleonic France or later the Germans, it would discover that its tactical advantages were not as decisive. Over time, the Battle of Kagel occupied very different places in the national memories of the countries involved. In Russia, it became a symbol of military glory and tactical genius. Russian historians celebrated it as one of the greatest victories in their history, proof of the superiority of the modernized Russian army. In Turkey, on the other hand, Kagel was largely forgotten or minimized in an empire that would experience defeat after defeat during the 19th century. One more did not seem particularly memorable. Turkish historians preferred to focus on earlier periods of Ottoman glory when the Sultan's armies threatened Vienna and dominated the Mediterranean. In Western Europe, the battle was largely ignored. French, British, and German historians focused on the wars that concerned them directly. Kagul seemed a distant conflict on the margins of Europe, with no direct impact on Western affairs. This perception was erroneous, as the battle and its consequences profoundly altered the European geopolitical balance. The village of Fiume, Osir, renamed Kahal, in Moldova, today retains few traces of the battle that took place there. The region has changed hands several times over the following centuries, passing from Russian domination to Romania, then to the Soviet Union, and finally to independent Moldova. Farmers who cultivate these lands walk unknowingly on a battlefield that was the scene of one of the most important military confrontations of the 18th century. The Battle of Kagel on August 1st, 1770, was much more than a simple military clash. It marked a turning point in European history, accelerating the decline of the Ottoman Empire and the rise of Russia as a great power. The 4 hours of combat near the village of Fumo Asa had repercussions that would be felt for over a century. Rumiantsev's tactical genius, his ability to turn a seemingly desperate situation into a stunning victory, offered a model for the military commanders who would follow. His innovative use of mobile infantry squares revolutionized tactical thinking and influenced the development of the modern art of war. For the Ottoman Empire, Kagel was the beginning of the end. The battle revealed to the entire world the deep weaknesses that had been undermining the empire for decades. Despite some attempts at reform, the empire would never truly recover from this shock. Its long decline, punctuated by successive defeats and territorial losses, would ultimately lead to its complete collapse after World War I. For Russia, the victory opened the way for a massive territorial expansion that would transform a relatively provincial kingdom into one of the greatest empires in history. Access to the Black Sea, control of Crimea, influence over the Balkans, all these gains stem directly from Kagel and the victories that followed. But perhaps the most important lesson of Kagel is this: empires that refuse to reform, that cling to outdated structures and methods, are condemned to decline. The Ottoman Empire possessed a much larger population than Russia, considerable economic resources, and a strategic geographical position, but its inability to modernize, to reform its military and political institutions condemned it to defeat against a less numerous but better organized and more modern adversary. This lesson remains relevant today. In a constantly changing world, the ability to adapt to innovate, to question established dogmas can make the difference between success and failure, between survival and collapse. Marshal Rumiant Sev understood this in 1770, and that is what allowed him to win one of the most spectacular victories in military history. Grand Vizier Halil Pasha and the Ottoman Empire did not understand, and they paid the ultimate